Thank you so much, Lila, for that introduction. And I want to welcome everyone to our presentation today, the Somatic Approach to Healing. And I've titled the PowerPoint itself Somatic Therapy because we're going to go over different types of somatic therapy and what that looks like and how we actually start to integrate these services into our individual sessions. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I like to educate people about is something called orientation. And orientation allows us to connect to our environment through our senses. And I picked this image of the aurora borealis in order to allow something that's visually pleasing, or at least I find it visually pleasing, which is why I use the aurora borealis, just because of the colors. I really like the contrasts of the light colors, the green, the blue, the purple, the white, with the trees being dark. I really like the way that looks. It looks visually pleasing to me. You may not find it visually pleasing, and that's okay. But what orientation does is it allows us to use our senses to feel safe. And so I can do that by looking at an image, by looking at scenery, by looking at a person that feels calming or peaceful to me. That can help me feel settled and feel safe, because our nervous system primarily assesses for threat. Since we are wired to detect threat, we notice our surroundings. And for people who have trauma or PTSD, those people always feel that sense of being threatened or having a sense of threat present, even though there isn't anything currently threatening. So when we start to do somatic work with individuals, what we like to do is talk about orientation, invite them to orient by using, you can use any of your senses. It's pretty easy to use the eyes, which is why I like to use imagery, but you can also do it through sense of touch. You can do it through smell, through sound, and you can do it through taste. Some people find thinking of, let's say, for example, having cookies at grandma's house. You can smell them, you can taste what they taste like, and that might bring on a sense of safety. And so that's how we can orient to our environment. And so when we're working with someone who struggles to orient, or someone who doesn't really have that sense of safety inside, we want to help kind of connect them to why this is important. And providing psychoeducation is one of the biggest things I do when I'm in session with someone, because I want them to know why we're doing what we're doing. And so that's why I'm providing the psychoeducation around orientation, because it can help not only us have the understanding, but also our clients have the understanding, and how we are able to help them feel calm, relaxed, and find a sense of safety within their bodies. One of the things we look at when we do that is we ask them what they recognize or what they feel. It might be a sensation that happens in their body. It might be a feeling or an emotion. It might also be nothing. When I'm working with people who have chronic freeze states or in a state of shutdown or are depressed, they often do not feel much in their body. And we're going to talk about how to work with that population here. The first thing I want to go into in regards to somatic therapy is how we start to go inside the body, because somatic basically means of the body, and the modality that I'm trained in, along with some others, is somatic experiencing, which basically is interpreted to the experience of the body. And so when we do that, the first thing we do, as I had said, was orientation, being aware of surroundings, being aware of what things look like either inside the body or even externally. Sometimes people who can't notice sensations inside, we can invite them to notice external. Like, what do you notice around you? What does the air feel like around you? How does the ground feel below your feet? That's a way to start kind of orienting someone who can't touch into their bodies yet. The next thing we do is we notice the felt sense. We support them in noticing any sensations that might come up. They might not be able to notice sensations, or they might notice sensations inside. And a lot of people who have trauma or who come to treatment or therapy, they tend to have negative feelings or negative sensations or chronic pain and those types of things that we see. And so one of the things that we do is, with noticing the felt sense, we want to start by bringing them into positive sensations, recognizing what positive feels like versus the negative sensations. Yes, the negative sensations might be present, but what we do is we allow the positive to come in first so that we can then begin integrating the negative. Because what happens, we all have separate windows of tolerance, and people who have trauma tend to have smaller windows of tolerance. I'm going to go more into detail about the window of tolerance towards the end of the presentation, but since we all have separate windows of tolerance, you're going to have people who will not be able to tolerate much negative or much positive. So as we start to connect people to feeling the positive sensations, they're going to start to recognize that window growing, and their sensations are going to be able to improve over time. And as that happens, they're going to start to feel stronger and more resilient. Another thing I like to talk about when we go into somatic therapy and the purpose of it is that narrative is not as important as sensations or what the body's telling us. Historically, people would go into therapy and think, oh, I go into therapy, I talk about my traumas, I talk about everything I dislike, and then I'll feel better. And oftentimes they may recognize that that happened, but some people will actually reactivate or further traumatize themselves by going into the narrative or going into the story about their experiences. So the somatic therapy approach is sometimes narrative comes into play, but more so we look at the body and what the body needs versus what the actual story is. Because sometimes the story is not related to the experience of the body. Somebody might be talking about one thing, and then a different sensation or a different kind of experience will emerge within their body, and they'll notice those differences. And so we want to help invite them to recognize what their body is feeling or what's happening inside of them versus what's actually in their mind or the things that over time have brought them much distress. We also talk that tracking sensations help lead to trauma resolution. And the short version of this is oftentimes people are going to notice the things that are uncomfortable inside the body and the things that are comfortable. And what happens is we have those positive and negative things work together kind of as it's kind of like a way that we notice for every good feeling there's a negative feeling and vice versa. So if somebody notices a feeling or a sensation inside that doesn't feel good, there's usually a counteractive positive one. And so that's why we allow time for the body to integrate versus going into narrative. Because if we go into narrative, that could bring up other sensations or other things, or even have someone dissociate or check out of their experience of their body. And so we want to be able to find both the negative and the positive and have them work together for healing. Oftentimes people might notice in this process that things will start to move out of their bodies. I've worked with people who've said that they feel things coming out of the top of their head. I've worked with people who've said they feel things coming out of their fingers or their feet, or different parts of their body. They just have kind of this experience of things removing itself from the body. And that's what the purpose of somatic therapy is it's literally removing the trauma feelings or the trauma responses out of the body. I want to go over a little bit about what trauma is and how I interpret the definition of trauma, because you'll ask any kind of clinician what their definition of trauma is, and most people will come up with something different. The one that I heard that makes the most sense to me came from Russell Jones, who is a Somatic Experiencing Somatic Experiencing International faculty member who works out of Brazil. And I was assisting with him at one point in Prescott, Arizona, and he said that trauma is too much too quickly. And basically what that means is that since we all have our differences in resiliency, if we have too much of one thing or several things happen in a short amount of time or in an amount of time that we cannot tolerate, it will overwhelm our system or shut down our system. And those can lead to responses such as fight, flight, and freeze, which are natural nervous system responses. But when people have these traumatic reactions, they often get stuck in a fight, flight, and or a freeze response. If somebody feels a really intense emotion such as terror, rage, shame, panic, those really intense emotions are usually a result of something traumatic or something negative that has happened. It doesn't mean that they are going to sustain trauma or develop PTSD from said event, But that means that if a big emotion comes up, it's usually the body reacting to something that's potentially traumatic that's happened. People with high levels of resiliency and healthy windows of tolerance, they can process through those events with no issue. For people who have lower tolerances or lower resiliencies, they're not going to be able to process that as well. And even the smallest emotion might actually lead to somebody feeling too much intensity. And so what we'll want to do is be able to help them kind of see that resiliencies are different, and also help them build those resiliencies so that they can tolerate higher levels of emotion, so that they can move through them more effectively than if they do not have much resiliency. We also have high intensity events and low intensity or long-term events. And we used to call them, some people do still call them this, but they would say big T traumas and little t traumas. I've gotten the feedback from clients over the years that saying big T or little t feels like it's invalidating to their experience, because somebody who has what could be perceived as a little t or a smaller kind of trauma, they might have a huge reaction and it might sustain long-term damage for them. And so that's why I've shifted from saying big T, little t into high intensity, low intensity. Both high intensity and low intensity events can lead to trauma or develop into PTSD, and everyone is going to be different. I also like to say before continuing that people will say, oh, these things happened to me and I was not traumatized by them. Is that okay? Absolutely. Since everyone's different and everyone's resiliency is different, some people will be traumatized by a similar event that other people might not be traumatized by. Some types of trauma I want to go over. The first type is single incident trauma. The first thing I think of is the high intensity events like accidents, being a car crash, natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, single abuse or assault. The single incident, single abuses or assaults are typically non-relational, meaning that most likely it's from someone either you don't know or someone you don't know very well. Having a sudden loss or any type of loss, grief, can be considered a single event, single incident, high intensity trauma. Witnessing violence, and I also include this as even witnessing violence in the media. You don't have to see it in person to be negatively impacted by it. And then people who have chronic illnesses or chronic medical issues, such as chronic pain, fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease, etc. I generally like to ask what people see in this picture, and the first answer that people come up with is usually tornado. And when I'm speaking to a group of people in a crowd, I like to ask if anyone lives in an area or have lived in an area where they have tornadoes or hurricanes or other types of natural disasters, because it can bring up some kind of feeling of sometimes negative feeling, like it's scary or they feel fear, and sometimes people feel excited. They like to see things like this. It's something that brings joy to them. And it's interesting to see kind of the differences, that it's okay to have those experiences, and to even say, one person can say, you know, I don't think that that's safe or comfortable. And another person can say, you know what, that's really exciting. I'd love to be that person with the camera taking pictures of that kind of thing. And so I grew up in a small town called Paris, Texas, in Northeast Texas. It's about an hour and a half northeast of Dallas, if you haven't heard of it. And in Paris, they actually we have tornado season, because Paris is part of Tornado Alley. And throughout between April and July-ish every year, they have tornado season. So there's tornado watches, tornado warnings, tornado drills that schools do. And so as a kid, I was never in a tornado, but I did have to go through tornado drills at school, and I remember hearing tornado sirens, and I still know what that sounds like. And so I never experienced a tornado, so I never sustained trauma or developed PTSD from it. However, my nervous system was trained that if you see or hear tornado, you hear a siren, you hear a watch, you hear a warning, you know that that's bad and can hurt you. And so that's an example of our nervous system being naturally conditioned to attune to safety. So hearing tornado, seeing tornado, thinking that's bad and can hurt me, that's a safe response. though there are people who have experienced natural disasters who very legitimately are afraid of those kinds of things occurring and still have negative impact from those kinds of events that they might have experienced. The next type of trauma I want to talk about is complex trauma. This can look like a lot of different things, but when I think of single incident, I think of one thing kind of happening one at a time. Complex trauma, I see lots of things either happening at once, stacked on top of each other, or really quickly in succession. Could be over the course of several days, could be over the course of many years. The first type is ongoing abuse or neglect. This is for people who experience any type of abuse or any type of family members ignoring them, partners not caring for them, people who have been victims of domestic or community violence, people who've been bullied, people who are veterans or first responders. Fortunately, it's here at Tucson, we have a Veterans First Responders program called our Red, White, and Blue program. And so it's good that we're able to offer those people support, but at the same time, a lot of veterans and first responders do end up getting PTSD that may not be just from combat or from their experiences in the service, but it could also be from childhood that may not be related to that. People who experience single or ongoing betrayal, I think of that as people who have been in relationships and perhaps their partner has an affair and they have this fear that that's going to happen again if they want to stay in the relationship, and it just kind of keeps on impacting them over time. People who experience, it says recurrent physical or sexual abuse, but I view this as any kind of physical or sexual abuse. If anyone experiences ongoing physical or sexual abuse from a relational capacity, meaning from a loved one, such as a parent or a teacher or a coach or something along those lines, for the most part, it is going to create negative impacts within the nervous system, where the nervous system has that constant fear of something bad happening. And then people who experience abandonment. Abandonment can look like a lot of different things. And when I think of this, I think of people who might have had parents who were not providing healthy attachment or secure attachment to them, which we're going to talk about in a bit. And then also people who experience things such as being adopted. We do see that quite a bit here at Sierra Tucson for people who have struggled with feeling rejected by their biological family. The next type is developmental trauma, which I call this always complex trauma. And it's kind of that, event happening all at once or one after the other. That mostly occurs within the caregiving system. Again, this is relational types of trauma. Usually ongoing types of events are from people that you know and that you love and that you have relationships with, can interfere with healthy attachment and development. And so our relationships might be strained if we have developmental trauma. And one of the things people think of when they think of developmental trauma is childhood trauma, which is accurate. It is a true statement. However, our developmental phases are up through about age 25. And so people are experiencing that development. If they experience trauma during development, it can hinder their developmental processes and kind of put a hold on the body to continue to grow or continue to reach its true potential. Chronic relational problems or having an innate sense of self is bad, and we call this shame, but having that message of I'm a bad person. And generally, quite a bit of the time, these segue from the low intensity events or the invalidating kinds of experiences. Like someone may feel like they had healthy parents or a healthy childhood growing up, but their parents might have said certain things to them, such as, boys don't cry, put your big girl pants on and stop crying. There are definitely things, whether it's gender-based or it could be related to their relationships with their peers, or it could be related to their relationships with anyone else, but just kind of having this message of what that looks like. And one of the examples I like to use when I think of this is family members don't necessarily want to create trauma for their loved ones. They generally want to help be supportive. And so sometimes the things that they do or say that are considered shaming might actually end up being something that they might actually end up being something they tried to do in order to protect their loved one. And a couple of examples that I have as we move into the next topic, which is intergenerational or historical trauma. One of the things that has come up, and I've heard this from different people over the years, is they will say things like, oh, well, my parents would tell me things such as, there's one person I worked with who said that when he was about 5 years old, he'd walk into the grocery store with his mom, and his mom would say, he was a young black man, his mom would say, take your hand out of your pockets or they're going to think you're stealing. And so at 5 years old, this young black boy thought that he was bad or that he was wrong because of what his mother said. Now, mom wasn't trying to shame him. Mom was trying to protect him, trying to give him some kind of strength, some kind of survival tactic, because either she or someone she knows or a loved one had experienced the fact that because they were not white or because they were black, that they experienced something negative because of this color of their skin. And so he grew up thinking, I'm bad because I'm black. I'm a bad person because I'm black. And that was the message that he had been given himself. So again, these shaming messages over time, they actually don't necessarily, they're not intentional. And so when we're working with somatic therapy wise, someone like that, it can be really difficult to kind of get in there and start to unravel these messages that people get about themselves. The next type I want to talk about is intergenerational trauma and kind of how that gets handed down. The example I gave is very similar to that. They're also doing research studies where people who are survivors of the Holocaust, their loved ones, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., who were not present during the internment camps, they are experiencing symptoms as if they were. And that's showing that these things are being handed down over time, whether it's a physical reaction. And you probably notice when you're working with clients that there's going to be movement. There might be something, for example, if somebody's talking about something and they say, well, yeah, when I think about my parents and kind of what happened to me, I kind of get this experience that I just, I don't really know what it's about, but this thing just comes up for me. And so in a somatic approach, we see hands come up and we want to jump in, or myself as a somatic clinician, I want to jump in and say, what is this? What is this feeling? What is this sensation? And oftentimes what they might come to understand is they might say, this feels like stop, or this feels like go away. On the other side of things, you might see them do this and you start doing this with them to help mirror, but then you bring it up and then they put their hands away and they say, no, that's not, that's bad. I wasn't supposed to have my hands up. And so we get that a lot of seeing people having these messages of certain things. And so when we are working with individuals who might have intergenerational or historical trauma, we want to keep those kinds of things in mind, that if we're going to bring something to their attention, like if there's some kind of movement of their body, if there's some kind of thing that we're noticing that they're not aware of, that we want to kind of approach it in a gentle way, because they might feel that something like this is bad. You bring it to their attention, they shut it off. We also see that for people, you can't see my legs, but for people whose legs move, they have the anxious, anxiety kind of movement happens in their legs. They've probably been told sometimes, maybe as a child, you have ADHD, or perhaps they were told, stop doing that, it's annoying. And so they hinder these kinds of experiences in their body, whether it's through medication or through hindering the movement. And so what happens is we see that develop later on as stuff that they've kept inside their body all of this time. And so we want to work to help kind of mitigate that. We ask about predictors for developing PTSD when it comes to trauma. The predictors that come into play are the magnitude of exposure, is there prior trauma, and if so, how much, and what does social support look like? With this slide, I want to take a moment and just invite you to look at the image and see what you notice as you do that while I take a quick drink of water. I like to use this image because it really helps tap in to our attachment system. And when I'm doing somatic work with someone, I definitely want to get into the attachment piece as well, because most often that trauma and that PTSD is going to also come from some type of attachment rift or some type of attachment breach, whether it was something that was pre-verbal that they don't have memories of, or whether it was something that was really overt and just really uncontrollable for them. And I like to use this image because I ask all different types of audiences about what they notice when they see this picture. What do they see? And usually the answer is that they'll see a happy family. And that's one answer. And then another answer I get is a multitude of other things. People will say, oh, it looks like they're faking it for the camera, or it looks like the mom is squeezing the boy really tight, or it looks like a fake dentist ad. And I just hear all of these different messages of what this image looks like. And when I hear someone who sees something other than a happy or resilient family, most often they might have some attachment stuff of their own if they see something other than a happy family. Or perhaps they have some dysregulation. Or maybe that afternoon, perhaps they had an argument with a loved one and are just feeling a little dysregulated around that. So it could be a lot of different things. But it's a way that I kind of assess for attachment types of pieces and how I start to work with the attachment system, because attachment work is very important when we start to work with the nervous system and the somatic approach to healing. The different attachment types that I'll go over rather quickly is the secure attachment style. That's the attachment style that we want to have. We want to be able to have healthy relationships and be connected to other people. There's the ambivalent or anxious attachment style, where they're the ones who kind of have to have somebody there all the time. They need to be close to someone. And then the avoidant is the opposite of that, of like they really want connection and they really need connection, but they're so afraid of it. They're afraid of what might happen. There's the disorganized piece, and those are the ones that we primarily see for people who have experienced symptoms of personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder. And then there's the ambivalent avoidant attachment style, which is the I want you with me, no, I want you to get away from me. And it just kind of bounces back and forth. People who have a lot of attachment trauma are generally more ambivalent, avoidant, or disorganized, but everyone can have different types of attachment styles with different types of relationships. Some people might say, oh, well, with my partner, I have a secure attachment, but with my mom, there's definitely an avoidant attachment style there. And so they kind of see the differences. And it's okay to have those kinds of differences and views around that. And I invite you to just ask yourself what your primary attachment styles look like with your relationships, and kind of what they may be, and how that can help you gain an understanding of this type of piece. One of the trainings that I've been attending is called DARE, and it's Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experience, which is developed by Diane Pohl-Heller, who was one of the original founders, along with Dr. Peter Levine, of SomaticExperiencing. And so it's a lot of attachment-based somatic work, and it's a really cool modality to be able to work with other people and have that connection of attachment, be able to find that overall healing capacity with others. When we're healing attachment wounds and when we're working with people, the somatic approach to this kind of piece is when you're working with someone, they might not even recognize what it's like to be in therapy. They may not recognize what it's like to be in the care of someone who we would call a competent protector, somebody who would be there to kind of keep them safe. They probably are able to find someone if you ask them when they were a child or when they were young, or maybe even in adulthood, if they can't find anyone when they were young, that there's a competent protector somewhere, somebody who would be there for them, even if it's somebody that they can create. When you're working with someone and are working on attachment issues, asking them something like, what's it like to be in my care, is really a way to help them see you as someone who can be a competent protector for them, someone who can be someone that's safe. And you might ask them what it's like to be in your care, and then they'll say, this is bad, I don't like this. And then that's a place to start, to just kind of be like, what's it like to tell me that? What's it like to notice that experience? and I kind of touched on this a little earlier, kind of the old school approach to therapy is, hey, tell me all your traumas and then you're better. Instead of saying to somebody, what happened to you or what are your traumas, you say, what should have happened that didn't? Attachment trauma, developmental trauma, and somatic work, it's not just about what happened to somebody or what the bad things are. It's also what didn't happen that should have. What did you need in order to get that healthy, loving connection or that environment? What kind of care would your parents have needed in order to have been there for you in a better, healthier way? When also doing attachment somatic work, we want to use eye contact and be able to connect with people. And I've been through this presentation trying my best to kind of look at the camera to be able to provide eye contact, even though it's virtual and it's not really eye contact. But I'm hopeful that being able to see that I'm making eye contact is a way to kind of help people feel settled. And it's something that I do or try to do in order to help keep a nervous system resilient, because I'm basically mirroring my nervous system to yours. And the eye contact is helpful to be able to say, I'm here, I see you, and I'm present. And then the other piece of attachment work is recognition of rift and repair. And basically what this means is that in any type of attachment relationship, especially in therapy, there are going to be rifts in the relationship, whether it's the client gets upset with you about something, or perhaps there's some anger that comes up, and it might not be about something you did or something you said, but to be able to be there with them through that rift and be able to be present for repair. Because oftentimes somebody who's had an avoidant type of attachment, they might say, you know what, I don't like this relationship, I'm leaving. So to be able to set the standard in your first session to say, hey, I'm probably going to disappoint you in this attachment relationship, and I want you to be able to stick it out with me. That's a way to help kind of develop that initial strength and that repair before the rift even starts, so that they can be able to have the informed consent for themselves to say, yes, I do consent to being able to be here, even if things are difficult, even if I get upset, or even if there's a rift in the relationship. And that's one of the things we want to get into for all of our relationships, is be able to have rift and repair. And that's a really good way to model that for our clients. I want to go over a little bit about the autonomic nervous system, how it all works, and how we start to look from the somatic approach of how to work with these pieces. But the autonomic nervous system is connected to everything inside. So if I get into a state of anger, sadness, fear, my nervous system is going to have some kind of responses. So if I'm having a fight or flight response, my nervous system, my heart rate's going to go up, my blood pressure will increase, I'm going to sweat, probably there's going to be digestion, probably a cease in digestion, because the nervous system gets so activated, and then an increase in respiration. If I'm relaxing, on the other hand, those other things they're going down instead of increasing, decreasing versus increasing. The job of the nervous system is to ensure our survival. It's the first part that starts working in utero, and the last to shut off if we're suffocating. Everything is connected inside, including our organs and our brain, to our nervous system. And so those things have responses and might have issues as well, which is why it makes sense for people who have quite a lot of trauma to experience illnesses such as Crohn's disease, fibromyalgia, and chronic pain. The sympathetic part of the nervous system is the getting us ready for action. That's our fight or flight response. It comes up, something's going to happen, and I'm getting ready to protect myself usually. The parasympathetic is the other side of that, which is the rest and digest piece. I'm going to slow down, I'm going to conserve energy. And parasympathetic can be viewed as freeze, and it can also be viewed as social engagement. The ventral vagal complex part of the nervous system, fight, flight. So if I'm going into a fight or flight response, most likely my chest is up, my shoulders are back, and I'm ready to protect myself, whether it's through my hands by fighting, or it's through my feet by running away. Can't see, but my trying to jump out of here, got to go protect myself. Usually fight responses are a relation to anger, not always the case, but it's usual. And then in the same way, fear and flight response are very similar. I've heard a professional talking about a lot of times waist up responses are fight and waist down responses are flight. And that's a really good way to remember kind of what that can look like. It doesn't mean that all those responses are equivalent to that. For example, if there's a impulse or a desire to kick someone, that's a fight response that happens below the waist. And then social engagement is a really big part of it too, meaning that I'm able to have social engagement in a ventral vagal part of my nervous system, in that I'm able to laugh, I'm able to experience joy, I'm able to have social engagement and connect with other people in a securely attached way. The other part of our nervous system, dorsal vagal, because ventral is up front, my chest is up and back, dorsal is going to be on the other side of things. So I might have my back hunched over. When you think of somebody who's depressed, you don't think of somebody who's up and smiling and engaged with you. You think of somebody who's more like this, and this is more dorsal vagal freeze response. There's a continuum of behaviors. I always do this when I'm talking about a continuum, but the continuum is very low on the continuum, not really trauma-based, but let's say, for example, I go around the house and I'm looking for my glasses. I can't find my glasses anywhere. And I ask my partner, hey, do you see my glasses? And they're like, oh, they're on your head. And I'm like, oh, duh. So that's very low level continuum freeze stuff. We all do it. It's not because of trauma. As we get higher on the continuum, that more developed from trauma, is things such as I'm losing track of time. I might not have access to certain years of my life. I've worked with people who've said, oh, I don't remember ages 5 through 8. That's a pretty specific time frame not to remember, and that's usually because something severely traumatizing was happening and they didn't come out of that until after the traumatic events had ended. And so that's kind of part of what that looks like. Higher on the continuum, you have people who have dissociative identity disorder or even catatonia. I did say that, you know, when you're in the dorsal state, it can be a possible state of depression. So for people who have chronic depression or clinical depression, there might be a trauma freeze component to that. And so it's something worth examining. When you're working with somebody who is possibly depressed, you'll want to be able to access their nervous system and be able to notice their felt sense to kind of see what they have access to. And then that's how we can start to have that healing process. Freeze comes online when fight and flight are not achievable. And dissociation, as we talked about, is that psychological construct. Dissociation and freeze are similar in a lot of ways. And then the other part of dorsal vagal complex, a freeze response, there is a video on YouTube if you want to check it out. It's a polar bear video. It is very dated. It is from the 80s. And for people who love animals, I don't necessarily recommend you watch it. The polar bear does not get harmed, but basically what they did is they had tracked down a polar bear in order to tag it so that they can monitor polar bear behaviors. And what they do is it shows a helicopter coming towards this polar bear, and they tranquilize it. They land. You don't see them land, but what you see is them with the polar bear, and the polar bear starts to come out of their freeze response that the tranquilizer put them into, and you see them, they're lying on the ground, and you see like the paws are moving, the head is moving, and what's happening is that's what running looks like. So when we're working with clients, when they go into freeze, they will come out in that same activated state. So since the polar bear was running and went into freeze at that point, as it's coming out of freeze, it's still kind of in that running response. So if we have somebody who went into freeze at a really highly activated state, such as rage, they might come out of freeze in that rageful state. And so having that awareness is going to be important, especially if there are self-protective responses involved, because they might have gone into a freeze state from a trauma that was happening, and perhaps their reaction might have been this. So if they're doing this in session and you mirror this for them and ask them what that's like, they may come out really sad, really angry, really afraid, because they're coming out of that freeze where their brain had basically, and their nervous system had shut down in order to protect them from the actual memory itself. So that self-protective response will want to come in. And so you'll see those a lot in session, these self-protective responses that come up. I'm using my hands a lot. You'll see them all over the body, but it's really just a way of the body saying, hey, this is incomplete and we need to move through this piece. This is the window of tolerance that I was talking about. There's a lot of different ways to look at the window of tolerance. This is the image that I have found that has been the most informative. And so if you want to get the PowerPoint in order to have that, it's going to be helpful to, looks like I'm a little blurry. Not sure what's going on with that. But in the PowerPoint, you'll be able to access this, and that way you can, if you have any questions about it, you feel free to email me afterwards. But basically, this kind of shows what the system can look like. At the very top, you kind of see the freeze section, and within freeze, you have dissociation, numbness, depression, those symptoms that come through, that dorsal vagal response, and body collapse. And so that, again, that feeling of depression where you're down like this, the dorsal vagal piece comes in, there can be an entire collapse. And you might notice in session somebody you're doing work with, and all of a sudden their head starts to hang low, and then they're like, I feel really sleepy, I want to take a nap. That looks like collapse to me. And that is often a way to be able to move through certain kind of deeper freeze responses. One of the ways to work with freeze is to be able to go into freeze as long as it's safe to do so. As you see, the middle section, the flight and fight section, it kind of shows you what those responses can look like. As you can see in orange, the flight responses, panic, fear, anxiety, and then the red, rage, anger, irritation, etc. And so you see those different kinds of responses that come up, and then also what deactivation can look like as well on the other side. So what we see here is, you see, this is like an activation state. And so you might have somebody who cannot even experience much more than frustration. And so that means that right here, this is their window of tolerance. They can only tolerate what's right here in this little area. Anything that would bring up fear or anger, that's going to be too much, and it's going to put them right up into freeze. And so our goal is going to be, in our trauma work and somatic work, is going to be to raise the window of tolerance to be able to have this full range of what they can feel within our fight, flight, or sympathetic responses. We want to be able to have this sympathetic access, because that's I can. That means I'm able to move through. I can't is very common in trauma healing because people feel so stuck. They feel in that state where they can't move through certain things. And then you have down here the social engagement piece, where we are connecting, we're feeling happy, we're feeling love, we're feeling joy, etc. And so that's really one of the things that I like to look at, is being able to see where we can be at this. Because if we're not in fight, flight, or freeze, we are most likely in social engagement, where we're enjoying life and things are feeling good and we're feeling connected. You can also see over here some more specific types of information about our parasympathetic, sympathetic, and our other parasympathetic nervous system. Since social engagement can be sympathetic or parasympathetic, you can kind of see both of the responses around that. But really, it's freeze as we're stuck. Sympathetic means that we are unstuck, but it might be uncomfortable. And the other part of parasympathetic social engagement is I'm feeling connected, I'm feeling senses of healthy attachment, and I'm feeling what I should be feeling as a human being. I like to show this image because it's a sign of healthy attachment. You see what appears to be a father and son kind of enjoying quality time together. And this is what I like to show for social engagement. The other image that I showed before might seem like kind of a trick image. This is not a trick image. This is really just a father and son enjoying time together. And then one of the last things I want to go over is our ventral vagal, the other part of our ventral vagal complex, which is the social engagement. Nourishing relationships, we're having fun, we're able to connect with other people. And what you'll see in treatment, which you've probably seen before with people you've worked with, or maybe people that you're currently working with, is you would see the piece around their face changing. And this is kind of difficult now to assess if you're seeing people in person in regards to COVID, but you're not able to see the full face. And so what I've noticed in working with people with somatic work is that their faces are actually changing. There is life coming back to them. You might notice a bigger smile, you might notice brighter eyes, you might notice a lot of different things that you hadn't seen before. And I know one therapist who actually in the first session he started working with someone, he would do somatic work and attachment work. In the first session with someone, he would ask them to take a selfie, and then in their final session after termination, he would ask them to take another selfie and look at the two pictures to see how much difference had happened during that time. And then I have another image just to show you as a reminder that orientation is important, especially after talking about these kinds of things. These are things that can bring up some uncomfortable feelings or some pieces of things that might not feel good. And so it's really just a way to kind of recalibrate and allow ourselves to just notice that settling within our systems. The naturalistic approach is the way we relate to animals in the wild, in that animals in the wild, they do not have a way of hindering their nervous systems. They actually allow their nervous systems have to do whatever their nervous systems do regardless. They have that sense of resiliency, whether they want to or not, because they have to for survival. They have the natural immunity just like we do. Our response is we get in the way. And the way we do that is either we can do it through eating disorders, we can do it through substance use, we can do it through video game addiction, sex addiction. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can hinder our nervous system's ability to do what it needs to do. But what we really need to do is allow our nervous system to take care of itself because it knows how. We just need to get out of the way in order to let it do so. Nature has instilled in all animals, including humans, a nervous system that's capable of restoring equilibrium for us. And then the overall signs of healing, improvement in quality of life to day-to-day functioning, the reduction of core symptoms, which is something we really like to see in working with others, and then the improvement in self-regulation. And then I have a little buddy I like to put here to kind of represent that animals can also experience parasympathetic rest. And it's something that we should strive to do, be able to have more of that resiliency, have more of that connectedness within our healthier or calmer selves. And then this was the end of the presentation for me. What I do have is I do have the opportunity now to answer some questions because we do still have some time left. So I'm going to turn to our questions and begin answering those if you have any. Oh, here's a good one. Can you elaborate on the reason chronic illness is single incident trauma rather than complex trauma? I view chronic health conditions as ongoing and layered. Flares and relapses of condition, separate medical trauma from procedures or medication and treatment trials, or side effects, progression of disease, etc. Yes, Jenny, thank you so much. That is a very good question. And it's listed in the single incident trauma. It is most definitely complex trauma. And it could even be developmental trauma, for example, for people who get chronic illnesses that are diagnosed when they're children. I know someone who was diagnosed with diabetes when they were very young, and it's definitely a huge complex trauma for them that they've had to do a lot of work on. The reason I have it listed as single incident is because typically the onset and or the diagnosis is the single incident. Just like a natural disaster, like the natural disaster itself is a single incident, and then the impact of the after effects of it are what are everlasting. So kind of the same kind of concept. Single incident being it's a diagnosis, the initial consult of it being the single incident, and then the impact of the complex trauma happening after that. And then let's see. Can you say what DARE stands for again? Absolutely. DARE is dynamic attachment repatterning experience. And the website is DianePoolHeller.com, and that's DianePoolHeller.com. Then other questions. What if experiencing internal sensations is triggering for clients? Where can we begin with them? That's a great question, Sonia. If they're experiencing something that is triggering, we want to start externally first. So one of the good ways to be able to have somebody, if they have triggering experiences inside, have them have a fidget toy or perhaps a blanket or something that they can feel externally that's going to give them the ability. And you can check out with them, say, what's it like to feel that? What's it like to play with that toy, or what's it like to squeeze it versus what's it like inside? And what we do with that is we allow them to gain more resiliency and strength by using external pieces to orient as opposed to the internal pieces inside, because sometimes inside is not safe. And if that's the case, we don't want to go into where it's not safe, because that's not going to be helpful for them and could be further traumatizing. And then from Elena, what are some strategies you use to help clients regulate? So one of the best ways I begin by helping people regulate, I like to help them regulate by orienting. Orienting is a very good way to regulate. Oftentimes too, going for walks is really regulating, being able to have people connect to the outdoors. I mean, and it's really gonna be individual for a lot of people. And so that's gonna give them the ability. You can say, what do you think would be most helpful for you right now? If they say, I don't know, which might come up for somebody who has depression, you could say, well, why don't we go for a quick walk? Or why don't we take a look around the room together? And you can do those kinds of things with them to be able to help connect them to the outside. Walks are really, really a good way to be able to connect to people. And I'll just actually type Diane's name real quick for everyone. There we go. Okay. And then let's see. Is recovery from trauma always considered ongoing, or is there recovery from event or events? Yeah, so the first thing about that is I want to say that most trauma recovery is ongoing, because you can't eliminate or erase things that have happened. EMDR is a modality that can help people feel less impacted by a certain event. But for the most part, in working with people, they don't necessarily want to forget what happened. They want to be able to have resiliency after what happened. And so that's one of the things that I recognize. But sometimes you can do a few somatic sessions with someone or some EMDR sessions with someone, and they feel completely resolved of their trauma after that. It doesn't mean that other things won't come up, but I think as far as if somebody is willing to do trauma work, the more they're dedicated to the trauma work, as long as they're not doing things like chronically abusing substances and that kind of thing while doing the trauma work, there will be results and there will be some resolution from that. I don't think that it ever goes away completely, but there's definitely an impact of it being way less negative for them. Let's see what else. Have you come across individuals or children who may have found the various emergency drills traumatic? I have not come across that yet, Rohini. I have noticed that when I talk about tornadoes in lectures, people might have an initial response, but then once I normalize it for them and let them know that it's okay to kind of have that fear response, they usually relax after that. But I haven't had anyone say that they've had those kinds of responses from the drills. And then let's see. Are you familiar with ventral vagal stimulation procedure for treatment of trauma? I'm not familiar with that. However, I know that there are some somatic ways or some somatic approaches in therapy to be able to help stimulate the ventral vagal nervous system. For example, people who have depression, one of the things, there was somebody I worked with a couple weeks ago who's kind of been in a chronic state of depression, and they had no access to any sensations in their body. And so what I had asked them to do is kind of when I was talking earlier, they started raising their hands like this, and I asked them what that was like, and they started kind of moving their hands, and I said, what would it be like to just push very slowly? What would it be like? And they did that. And after they were done pushing, after not having ever felt any sensations in their body, they started to feel tingling in their fingers. And so it was really cool. That's a way to kind of jump in and stimulate ventral vagal a little bit, because that helps. This is more like it could be considered fight or flight, but it's kind of that fight response of like no or get away. And to be able to have that access and be able to feel the tingling afterwards gives the body the sign of it's okay to be present. It's okay to kind of come into the body now. And let's see, any others? Ooh, what are some common positive sensations you often see when trying to make people connect to the positive versus the negative sensation? I really love that question, just because for therapists like me, prior to being a trauma therapist, I only saw the negative stuff. And so you start to see more of the positive stuff when you invite it. And so positive things that people notice, they say, oh, I feel warmth in my chest, or oh, it feels very airy in my shoulder, or oh, I feel very light, I feel very weightless. You know, there's little words that they say like that, and those are kind of sensations that come in that they're like, oh, it feels good. Or they say, you know, I feel like a coolness. It feels kind of cool, and I've been really hot, so that's really nice. And so you'll hear their language come in to say things like, oh, that feels really nice compared to what I'm used to, or this feels better. And it's not necessarily focusing on what's just positive, but also what feels better or what feels not as bad is a really good language to use. Instead of saying, well, what feels good? Well, they may not know what feeling good is at all. So to be able to say, you know, this is this connection that you're feeling, it could be better than bad. It could be neutral. So it doesn't have to necessarily be positive, but everyone's going to come up with different kinds of things. So everyone, it is 11 o'clock. I am so thankful for all of you attending today. I appreciate you all being here for the time that we spent. Again, if you have any questions, definitely you can overlook the PowerPoint or look over the PowerPoint, and my email is in the PowerPoint, and you can reach out to me directly if you'd like. And I'm sure Lila would also be available for any questions you have as well. I thank you so much for being here. I hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week. And I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.